It's okay, Camila.
It's okay? Great.
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, so good morning.
Morning.
Welcome to our third day of the 15th Symposium of Irish Studies in South America. My name is Camila Batista. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of São Paulo. And here with us is my colleague from graduate school, Eda Nagayama. And together we are going to interview writer Siofra O'Donovan. Let me remind you that you can post your questions on YouTube in Portuguese or English, so we can ask them to Siofra later, okay? So I will introduce the writer, our interviewee, and then I will pass the word to Eda, okay? So Siofra O'Donovan is from Wicklow, Ireland. She has published historical novels, travelogues, and has written a series of novels set in 12th century France. Among her publications are the novel Malinsky, published in 2002, Pema and the Yak, published in 2006 and reprinted as Lost in Shambhala, and out now in 2020, Yours Till the Hell Freezes. She has written cultural and travel features for the Irish Examiner, the Irish Times, and the Warsaw Voice. She teaches writing workshops in schools, mental health, and prison facilities using the dynamic and archetypal hero's journey. So welcome, Siofra. Thank you for accepting our invitation to talk to us today.
A great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Eda?
Yeah,
Eda?
thank you very much. I would like to thank also to thank Professor Laura Zaha and Mariana Buffarini, president of USP-ABEI, and all the other members that put so much effort to make this online event happen and so successfully. And I would like also to express my condolences to our dear Professor Munira Mutran for the recent loss of her life partner, Marcelo. Munira, along with Laura, was responsible for establishing and consolidating the field of Irish studies in Brazil. And this is the first time that she is not taking part of our yearly symposium. So, and of course, I would like to thank Siofra for being with us. If it's not, it's not possible due to the pandemic to be personal together. At least it's the positive part of it to be at least virtually online and so on. And so I would like to introduce a little bit how I met Siofra's work. And so I was working with Malinsky on my PhD as my object of study. And so at the beginning of my research, of my PhD research, I was interested in displaced people and how this idea of authority and otherness in writing fiction, how could you approach someone else's traumas, collective traumas. And then I was trying to find some women's works, and then I met Siofra. It was a kind of surprise for me to have her, an Irish writer who was has lived in Poland and writing about Second World War, and so that's why that's how I met Malinsky. I had to find how to know about her, and we were able to meet in last year ISL event, and so Siofra has a very different subjects. She's interested in very different subjects and motives, and so and her most recent book, it's this one, Yours Till Hell Freezes, a memoir of Kevin Barry, and Kevin Barry is her great uncle. And so again, we are talking about, you know, how this kind of, it's possible to think about inheriting someone else's memory, someone else's story, and how, if you are connected or not. In the case of Malinsky, she was not connected directly to the Jewish victims or the Polish victims, but in the case of Kevin Barry, she is his great niece. And so we are going to to listen to her, to discuss a little bit about this kind of, you know, different subjects and how her process of writing, you know, it's for her, she understands for herself. And so the floor is yours, Siofra, please. Thank you.
Okay, so with Yours Till Hell Freezes, yeah, as you say, it's very much like a very direct connection to the experience of war and trauma through a family member. So on my father's side of the family were all of these revolutionaries who did quite significant things. Like, well, Kevin was 18, he was hanged by the British after a court-martial because of his part in an ambush. And the story of Kevin Barry, you know, he was always, you know, we didn't sing his famous song, which is sung by Leonard Cohen and Paul Robeson and every Irish folk artist and musician you can imagine. We didn't sing that song in our house. That wasn't how he was remembered, because my grandmother said it was a maudlin song. Don't be singing that, it's sentimental. Probably because they couldn't cope with the actual grief of, you know, that my grandmother lost her brother when she was a young teenager and her brother was hanged. Can you imagine how that would feel? But that's the reality. So the memories of Kevin Barry, they were always in the house in different ways. For example, I write about this quite a bit in the book, these different little items in the house that were evocative, except some of the things were associated with him I didn't even know. For example, a black thorn, what we call a shillelagh, which is a kind of looks like a walking stick, but actually you'd use it in a sort of battle to hit somebody. There were shillelagh kind of games in Irish traditional culture, and this was actually a walking stick that I played with as a child. I used it as a broomstick to play as a witch or whatever. But years later, after my father died, and he wrote a previous biography on Kevin Barry, which is why I decided to do this one, I went to the National Museum and I was shown the collection, and I suddenly sees this walking stick in the National Museum collection. I go, what's that doing there? She said, well, your father gave it to us in 1983. I said, how is that possible? What's it? Why? She said, because it belonged to Kevin Barry, because apparently he made it. You know, so as a young man, he made his own shillelagh. So that was a interesting surprise anyway. Another thing that was in the house was Dad's study, which he called the Republican plot. And he had his father, who was quite revolutionary, and Kevin Barry. They were both hanging there. These faces were always looking at me, always looking at me. Their eyes followed me, and kind of like family ghosts, somewhat friendly. My grandfather always looked a little bit more stern to me as a little girl. But my father's library was lined with all these books about nationalism and republicanism. He wasn't a Republican as such. But anyway, that's like the story was so close to me, and the story of the boy who was hanged, and he's your great uncle. And look at this letter, my father would say, look at this letter he wrote. And a lot of those letters are in the book now and everything. So it was like something suffocating for me. I didn't want to carry this history. And also beneath that history is a lot of trauma. So that's interesting for you, Eda, but it is a traumatic history where, you know, a splinter group or a group of IRA volunteers are at war with the British Army, you know, and here's a young man, he takes part in an ambush. He's been, you know, quite accomplished as a soldier for the last couple of years since he was 15. And then, you know, he's caught. So the trauma is for the family, losing him, the mother, Mrs. Barry, my great grandmother, you know, losing him, losing her son, but nobody would speak of that. They hardly spoke of him, you know, the women, especially in the family, they hardly spoke of him. So that's Kevin Barry. And then my father wrote a book about him in 1989. And now I've just published this new book about him, in which I include a lot of new papers, which the Barry family, or my cousins, they really helped me with giving me access to their private collection. And then I went into very new, well, not very newly released, but when my father wrote his book in 1999, he had no access to the witness statements. from the Bureau of Military History. And these are fascinating documents. One of the best ones was by Kevin Barry's sister. She's fascinating. And she writes it like a novel. It's just incredible. And the final piece of the jewel that I found in among those witness statements was the priest, Father Lawrence, whose statement gave an account of how he met the priest Canon Waters. He knew the priest Canon Waters, who was with Kevin Barry to his last moments in the gallows. So that was a very powerful description of what happened. How they were together, for example, the night before the execution. And a very tall, kind of almost elegant looking man walked in, and Canon Waters was the name of the priest. He said, he thought to himself, he must be the doctor. And he and Kevin looked at each other. And then the man came in and he measured Kevin's wrists, because he had to put those, I think they're called minions, on his wrists. And at that moment, Canon Waters realized, oh my God, it's the executioner. So they just met John Ellis, the executioner, part-time hairdresser, part-time executioner. Asked for a pay rise after he hanged 10 men in Mountjoy. Said, I'm not getting paid enough, it's very stressful.
And I was wondering, Siofra, how was that for you, that, trauma, and, you are his great grandniece. How do you felt to you the presence of Kevin Barry, this presence that was not physical, but as it was a trauma for your family? How do you, the children, the nieces, the grandnieces, and your cousins, how did it felt for you, this presence of Kevin Barry?
Well, I didn't consciously feel it as a trauma when I was growing up. It was like, first of all, my dad always talking about him, and then researching and writing his own book. And he said to me when I was 11, he said, what book am I going to write next? And I said, you're going to write a book about Kevin Barry, surely? And he said, okay, I will. And off he went, but we had this connection, me, Dad, and Kevin Barry. I can't really understand it to this day, but all I know is that Kevin Barry, as an ancestor, has not left me alone since I was a child. And I, for years, resisted it, and, would have lived abroad in Poland and India and the Himalayas, probably trying to get as far away from this history as possible. Family history.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we first talked on, the first interview, it was written and so on. And so you sent me some answers. I was asking about Malinsky and so on. You used these words like you perceive it like some kind of a ghost in Krakow, for example, about, the character Henry and Stanisław, especially Stanisław, and that he was a kind of a ghost that he demanded his story to be told. Do you think that also Kevin Barry in your family, he claims for his story to be told in a more broader sense, in the sense that he's not just about the fight for independence, but his personal story? Do you think that's a kind of claim?
Yeah, definitely. I felt like, hijacked by Kevin Barry, just as I did by Stanisław for the beginning of Malinsky. I felt, all I wanted to do simply after my father died in 2009 was to republish his book. But it became something much more, because I realized there was more about him as a human, as a person, as a young man, as a character that had to come across. And because I'm a novelist, I felt I would be able to do that. My fears were on embarking on such a project was around the historical accuracies and everything, but I ended up, reading documents for years. So there's a kind of combination in the book. It's not an academic book. It's a historical memoir. So I wanted to bring in that personal thing, the relationship to my father, his relationship to Kevin Barry, the relationship of my grandfather, who was a very big IRA man, and his relationship to Kevin Barry, not that he knew him, but he married Kevin Barry's sister, my grandmother. So you know, the complexity of coming from a family where everything was so connected. And so under the shadow of this Republican movement, but the generation, my father's generation, tended to step back from anything to do with the IRA and the difficulties and the complexities of the situation with the North, which was what the British basically left with, as in India, a problem, a border problem. They leave border problems everywhere, like they did in India, you know, leaving civil war in their wake. So anyway, but my grandfather would have been very extreme to the very end of his days about he wanting a united Ireland, not wanting to ever accept the treaty terms at the end of the War of Independence, that he would always be anti-treaty. He would always be very, very angry that Ireland didn't get full independence. Now, I don't really care for him, but I can see the dreadful complexities of the North and its relationship with Britain and Brexit. It's very difficult to understand, very complex, but we have to hope for the best with Brexit.
I know that you are in the first period of, you know, promoting your new book and so on, but do you feel, what kind of, you know, how it's been received until now? I don't know, first impressions and so on, in relation to, also due to the Brexit situation that, you know, is going to promote some kind of, you know, twisted form, this kind of united Ireland, because the border is not possible to establish it again. And so how do you see this kind of, the book and this kind of perspective of the Brexit and how it's been received at this first moment?
Well, I mean, I've just been interviewed by a few newspapers, and the feedback I've had from people who've read it is that I've given a picture of the independence movement from the perspective of family, from a family. So it's almost easier to track. As somebody who's a poet down in Cork, he said to me, well, you've given an insight into the War of Independence through the eyes of the family, the Barry family. So it is a very interesting way to track that narrative, you know, and because I'm a novelist, that's the way I wanted to do it. I didn't want to do it as a study. I'm not interested in being an academic. It's not interesting to me at all. I want people's stories, and that's why I took the witness statements and I went deep into those. I dug really deep into those witness statements. And what you find is some fascinating things. As for Brexit, I don't know how to answer that question. It's so complicated. I can't even get my head around it right now. Sorry. Maybe, you know, I mean, in a way, Kevin Barry was sort of hijacked by, you know, the IRA, the provisional IRA by Sinn Féin as a kind of icon. And I mean, why wouldn't they hijack him, I suppose? But it would be nice if he could be a hero of this country for everybody. And what it really is quite annoying in Ireland is how the middle classes dissociate themselves for anything to do with our independence movement, mostly. They're not interested. You don't ever see any middle class housing estates that have the names of our independence heroes. You only see that in working class areas in Ireland. For example, my sister lived in Connolly Square after James Connolly, 1916, you know, but you will never see a Wolfe Tone Square, Wolfe Tone hero of 1798 rebellion. You'll never see a Wolfe Tone Square for middle class people. Never. They don't want to know, you know. So there's this strange thing in Ireland where we don't celebrate our Independence Day. We don't. You know, there's all these difficult, conflicted feelings around these commemorations for Kevin Barry even. Okay, COVID is there, but there's more to it than that. You know, if you go on and on about, you know, independence heroes, you might be seeing as being a bit of a Republican or, I don't know. Anyway, I think we should forget all that and just celebrate the fact that people did give their lives so that we wouldn't be ruled from Westminster. I'm pretty happy about that. Not too happy with the Irish government, but, you know, I think I wouldn't be happy at all with Boris Johnson as my prime minister. So I'm grateful, and I think that we should. And I think it's silly that we don't.
Siofra, do you think that this resistance to celebrate, to commemorate the memory of, the national heroes and people who fought for Ireland's independence, it has something to do with the troubles in the north, in an attempt to avoid more troubles, more conflict with the north and so on?
Yeah, I think so. Because in that polarity, if you celebrate all these heroes, the average middle class person does not want to be associated with those heroes for that reason that I explained. They just don't. Mm-hmm. Not all of them, of course, but it's just generally not very trendy. And it has been the case since the Troubles. Whereas before that, as the Free State of Ireland was growing and emerging, there was still great pride. There was far more pride, but there were still the Civil War wounds. So depending on what side you'd been on or what side your family had been on, But let's not talk all the time about Ireland. Let's try and talk about other countries.
Oh yeah, sure. Before switching the subject, I'd like to show one of the videos that you sent the link about Kevin Barry in cultural memory, how he is present in songs and popular ballads. There is a song by Leonard Cohen about him, about Kevin Barry, about your great uncle. So I would like to show parts of the video. Is that
Great.
okay?
Yeah,
okay.
Fantastic.
Okay, so just stop sharing here and share the video. Just a moment. It's here, so let me make sure you can hear the sound.
There's a song written a long time ago that I learned, and it was written in 1916 after the Easter Rebellion in Ireland. And it's not that I wish to burden you here with another war, another cause, but there are struggles in other places in this, and they all amount to the same thing. That is men of 18 and 19 getting killed. And this is one from Ireland. Early on a Sunday morning, high above a gallows tree, Kevin Barry gave his young life for the cause of liberty. Just a lad of 18 summers, yet there's no one can deny that he went to death that morning, nobly held his head up high. Shoot me like an Irish soldier, do not hang me like a dog, for I fought for Ireland's freedom on that dark September morning, when all around the little bakery we fought them hand to hand. Shoot me like an Irish soldier, for I fought to free Ireland. Just before he faced the hangman in his lonely prison cell, British soldiers tortured Barry just because he would not tell the names of his companions, other things they wished to know. Turn informer and we'll free you. Proudly Barry answered no. Shoot me like an Irish soldier, do not hang me like a dog, for I fought for Ireland's freedom on that dark September morning, when all around the little bakery we fought them hand to hand. Shoot me like an Irish soldier, for I fought to free Ireland.
Okay, so now Eda, would you like to ask another question?
I would like to bring Jessica Grant question. I think that has to do with this, you know, this the idea of retelling the story of a relative. And she asks, do you think that telling the story of a relative whose death was traumatic and he was so young, as you know, we can hear in the song, he was young and tortured and so on. Was very traumatic, collectively traumatic, I think, also, you know, moving for in that period. And so she asked, of a relative whose death was traumatic, helps in dealing with the trauma and looking into the past and future differently. Do you think that it changes the way you see it or you deal with it?
To remember always with Kevin Barry is that, yes, it was traumatic and we can't imagine what it's like to be hanged. But we have to remember, and this is something very important in the book, is that he really had an incredible sense of humor, and his letters convey this. That's for me in the family what was always brought to life and what was remembered of Kevin was that he had a wonderful sense of humor. You know, I would have been able to read letters of his to people from the letters that he wrote from Mountjoy Prison to his friends or to his cousin in Kildare or whatever. And he's always just having a great time. Oh, I was off at this dance, and I can read you one of the letters. Or I fell into the ditch. I was so drunk on my bike going from, you know, Hackettstown up to Glendalough. This is the human, you know, side of things, and that's the side that Dad always reminded me of, and the way he spoke about him. He was young, he was a student, he was a medical student, and he loved life, and he loved girls, and he loved drink, and he loved dance, and he was very passionate about the freedom of his country. So I didn't live through the trauma of what happened until I started to get into the nitty-gritty of writing about the days going up to the execution and the detail of, you know, the medical records, all of that. And then the actual hanging, what was done, every detail, how the rope was put around the neck, everything. And at that time, I was researching it. I met this guard, Sean Reynolds, and he had been overseeing the exhumation of Kevin's body from Mountjoy Prison to Glasnevin Cemetery, which is where all the Republican people are buried. And Sean had been the guard that overlooked, and he could describe to me in interviews the cufflinks on Kevin's shirt, still there. The waistcoat, still there. The boots, still there. So it was incredible. That was 2001, the exhumation of the body. Now, at that time, I think it was 2000, actually. I can't remember. When was September the 11th, 2000 or 2001?
2001.
2001, yeah. So that's when September 11th happened. I wasn't deterred. I was already arranged to go to New York. I was doing a residency in upstate New York, and I was determined to go. I had a brilliant time. Meantime, all that was going on in Ireland, and you know, I didn't even think about it. The exhumation of the body, enormous national ceremony for the 9-10 men who were executed in Mountjoy at that time. Their bodies were all being taken over to Glasnevin, except one whose family wished for him to be buried I think his name was Patrick Moore, I'm not sure, or Patrick Moore, to be buried in his hometown, and the rest of them were all buried in Glasnevin. And I remember just going, oh, thank God I'm in New York. I'm sick of all that, you know. But I've written at length about it in the book, not at length, but I have a chapter or so. And Dad had kept all the newspaper cuttings from every single newspaper, every account of it, every feature, every letter to the Irish Times editor, everything was written about. I mean, he kept all the newspaper cuttings, and he had his own speeches that he'd read and all sorts of things. So it is a very rich chapter. And what does commemoration mean? How do we remember? And what trauma comes up with that, Ida, you know, remembering. So for me and my sister, in November, when I was doing that research into Kevin's time in Mountjoy and the hanging in the gallows and all of that, we did relive something. We both acknowledged to each other that this was huge for our grandmothers, our great aunts. It was huge, our grandmother, our great grandmother. It was a huge thing to lose him. And we really actually felt it for the first time, maybe. And we very quietly sang his song in the gallows, and it was enormous. And very sadly, my sister passed away in July, so I'm very sad that she can't see this book come to fruition. She was part of the journey. She really felt it, and she really appreciated that I was uprooting and finding other ancestors of ours. Sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry. I think that my internet is not super stable.
So like yeah, that's the thing. Like I found a lot of other ancestors that I hadn't been aware of. So for example, this Friday, I'm going to meet my cousins who are Barrys, and we are going to walk to the ancestral land of our great grandmother. So that's very special. We've never been there. I've never been there. They live near it, but I've never been there. So it actually came to me in a dream. My great grandmother, Mary Dowling, said, you need to go there. So we're going. I'm going. So that's
you
the
mentioned
magic.
this. You mentioned this in an interview that you start a book with a dream or a vision. How this work, this kind of thing work for you in the sense of okay, you said now that you are going to this place, you're going to visit and with your cousin, and how this kind of spiritual layer, because you had this experience in your life going to Himalayas and, you know, dive deeply in this kind of spirituality. And how does it work for you? Because you mentioned in Malinsky, you mentioned about this vision of Stanislav in Krakow, and then now you mentioned about, you know, this kind of a dream. And how does it work for you? How consciously it is, or how do you you know, take advantage or use this kind of experience to write? How does it work?
It's a huge part of my creative process, where since I was a child, I was always very aware of the spirit world and everything. And it was more important to me than the human world. So for Malinsky, you know, I had that vision of Stanislav on the top of a tower block. I was only in my 20s. So why was a girl in her 20s writing about an old man who was remembering the war? You know, looking back, it's pretty weird. Why would all my contemporaries were writing maybe chick lit or something, you know, more racy or fun, but I'm stuck in World War II with old men. So I don't seem to have a choice. That happened. Stanislav, the vision came. I wrote the first page of the novel in Krakow, and I came back and researched everything about World War II, and I came home and wrote the novel in 9 or 10 months. With Pema and the Yak, my book about the Tibetan people living in exile in India and the Himalayas, that was also a dream. I was living in Dharamsala. I was studying Tibetan. I'd been sent there by a Tibetan Lama to study and to be a translator. And I had a dream, and I saw in my dream Pema, a female Tibetan nomad, coming out over the Himalaya with her yak. And I have a drawing of that, a painting that I did while I was living in India, which was of that vision. So that's on the front of the book that was published by Pilgrim's Books, but that seems to be a little bit out of print. It was then republished on Amazon Kindle as a Kindle thing, Lost in Shambhala. So there's very few print copies of that book left. But again, it was a dream. And it was like, you got to tell the story of these people. So that was my thing for that. And then, well, similar, well, I suppose with Kevin Barry, it was just always there. He's always been around. And then with my French novel set in 12th century France, well, that was kind of through discovering, it was, I taught a very strange workshop series as an experiment. It was called the Unicorn Tapestries workshop series. So each week we wrote, inspired by a particular French tapestry. They're the Unicorn Tapestries. They're in the MoMA in New York. Maybe not the MoMA, maybe the other one, the Metropolitan. Anyway, so from writing each week, a book came, and it was the story of this girl, sort of princess in 12th century France. But historically, I had to do all the research for that. That took many years. So she was the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII. And it's a time travel book. And someone mentioned that they were going to ask me something about why do I write historical fiction? Yeah. Well, yes. Isn't that right, Camila?
Yes.
Well, because I think since I was a child, I've, fascinated by the idea of time travel. So history fascinates me. I believe when we are really immersed in a historical period, whether we're writing, creating, just reading about it, we are actually experiencing that. And it is another dimension, another reality. So with the 12th century novel, it is about traveling. The heroine travels from 21st century Vancouver back to 12th century France in Aquitaine. So that's historical fantasy, historical fiction. I mean, Malinsky was more accurate historical fiction, but that was more historical fantasy, was the 12th century book, which is not yet published.
Oh, okay. Siofra, I would like to remain the subject because, you wrote Kevin Barry's memoir, and then, but your other works don't deal with Ireland. And many other historical fiction writers are not dealing with Ireland's history, Irish history. So is that intentional for you? You don't want to deal with Irish history, or is there any other reason for being interested in other countries' histories and so on?
Yeah, well, I would like also to comment on this because I would like to listen about the Irish identity, because you don't feel that you mentioned that you don't feel that much Irish, or you don't want to live your whole life in Ireland. You want to live somewhere else, and all the time this idea of traveling, this idea of some approach to other peoples or to other perspectives, and in the sense of with the local experience, you need to be there in some sense, as you were mentioning, New York or Himalayas or Poland or somewhere else, or Portugal now. And then what kind of do you think that there's some kind of reaction in relation to this Irish identity, to the Irish burden of this history of conflict? I don't know how you deal with that. And so how does it work for you?
Yeah, on that level of Irish history is very complicated and very difficult and full of suffering, like terrible suffering. It's not that long ago they were starving in ditches, not so much on the East Coast, but seriously, it's a torturous history. It's dreadful. So we're also, well, right now, the government is very strange as well. And every government is very strange all over the world right now, with their rules and their violations of constitutional rights. It's very upsetting. So basically, I always wanted to escape from Ireland. Oh yes, from the age of 18, 19, I was dreaming of going to India, and then I met, in my final year in college, I met a Tibetan Lama who became my teacher, and he sent me to India. I was never happier, so happy that I had a reason to go to India to study Tibetan, to be in Dharamsala, to become a translator, which I didn't actually do. I just went on and wrote a book based on my research there, and going into the Himalayas and getting as far away from Ireland as I possibly could, to places that were dry, not wet like Ireland, where there was no rain. I hate rain. You know, where things were just radically different. So, and I'm kind of like a chameleon as well. Like if I'm in the Himalayas and I was studying Tibetan and I was sitting down with villagers in their village homes, listening to their stories of whatever, you know, stories of things that were going on in their village, or things about Tibet and what life had been like there and everything, I was happy as Larry. I get very claustrophobic in Ireland. I find it a very parochial country. It's very small. I did my book about Kevin Barry in honor of my ancestors, in honor of my father, my grandfather, my grandmothers, and Kevin Barry, of course. But I really, when I began that project, my heart was very heavy. I didn't want to do it at all. I was really anxious. It took me a long time to get into it. I was dreading reading all those military history documents. I really was. It was such a heavy burden. I really resisted it. And so instead of, at the beginning of 2018, I just went, oh, well, I think I'll just keep writing my novel. And I continued writing my 12th century novel until it was finished. And then I started on the Kevin Barry book. So they overlapped and all that, you know, they had to, because, yeah. So, you know, it's very heavy history, and I moved to Poland, which has a very heavy history as well. I found that very burdensome, but I wrote Malinsky, I got that out of my system, and I still moved back there in 2006. I worked in the university in Krakow, and then when I had my child, we have my baby here in Ireland. So I came back to Ireland then. That was the bringing me home, having the baby. So, but I kept writing. But I was writing, like when my son was very young, I was writing mostly, how would I call it? MG, middle grade fantasy for you know, younger 9 to 12-year-olds. I wrote one of those books. I wrote 2 actually, but they were just for me. They were just for me to, you know, find my way in this new identity of being a mother and being back in Ireland. And I missed traveling so much. In fact, I missed it so much that I brought him everywhere I could before he was 2, when it would be a full price ticket. So we lived in India again. We lived in Nepal, and then I came back. And we still traveled a lot. We always travel a lot. Of course, now it's very annoying. You can't travel, but have to stay put for the moment.
Yeah. I have another question here from Mariana. Mariana said, Kevin Barry's story reminds me of that of Roger Caseman as a ghostly figure haunting the present. Could you expand more on that? You know, you told us that Kevin Barry is actually buried next to Roger Caseman in Glasnevin, right? So could you talk more about that, you know, Roger Caseman and Kevin Barry as ghostly figures?
Yes. Well, Roger Caseman had a very difficult fate. I mean, he was instrumental in bringing the arms in from Germany to Cork, and it all went wrong. And he was executed in 1916 for his part in the Rising. And he had the same executioner as Kevin Barry. So he had the executioner was called John Ellis. And so that was one reason maybe why Kevin became so famous, was because he was the first person to be hanged after Roger Caseman, after 1916. So there were 9 others, young men, that were hanged after Kevin, including Boy George's great uncle, Thomas Bryan, and a number of other men, Patrick Moore and I can't remember all of their names offhand. But Roger Caseman, yes, that's correct. His grave is right as you walk in the gates of Glasnevin Cemetery. I know that Marianne has seen it. It's there. And now I'm not sure when he was buried there. Was he? It couldn't have been in 1916. So his body must also have been exhumed. I'm not sure about that. But Kevin didn't arrive beside him and become his neighbor in the graveyard until 2001. Yeah, wasn't it 2001? I always get it wrong. The year of September 11th, whatever.
Okay. And you come from a lineage of writers, like your father wrote the book about Kevin Barry, and you mentioned your grandfather also was a writer.
My grandfather, who was very extreme in the IRA, he wrote a biography of Kevin Barry in the 1950s. And this has been a complete mystery to me as to where that book has gone. The manuscript is vanished. It's not in the National Library with my grandfather's papers. His name was Jim O'Donovan. A book was written about him by my father's friend, David O'Donoghue, The Devil's Deal. It's a really good book, but it's a very hard book to swallow and to accept the extremes to which my grandfather went for what he believed in. Some of it's, violent and everything. He also collaborated with the Germans, the Nazis, the Abwehr. The big story,
Siofra, I would ask you to talk a little bit more about this story, because it's so interesting, this kind of, this affiliation of your father and your grandfather, and your father received some kind of inherited from his father, and how this kind of sympathy towards the German perpetrators, and your position, it was a kind of reaction or completely opposite to that, but in some sense it's portrayed in the book in Malinsky. And so would you like to tell us a little bit about this story? It's so interesting, the objects, the rifle that he kept and the knife and so on.
Well, so when my father was 12 years old, my grandfather had already arranged for about 6 German spies to parachute into Ireland. So the idea was that England's problem, while they were going to be at war with the Germans, England's problem is Ireland's opportunity. That was how the saying went. So let's collaborate with the Germans to get at the British. And there was a lot of caution over such a thing by Eamon de Valera later on. But some people, my grandfather was imprisoned for this as well. But they parachuted in anyway, and one of them landed in County Meath, and his name was Herman Gertz, and so he was an Abwehr spy. And the local story goes, which I heard completely randomly from a person who lives there that I know is a friend, that this spy landed up in a place called Ballivor, County Meath, and the spy turns around to the man in the field, the farmer, and said, "Do you know where I am?" And the farmer looked at him and said, "It's Ballivor. Do you not know Ballivor?" And so the spy realized, "Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Okay, I need to get to Wicklow." And so he made his way up to Wicklow. He walked, I believe, and he found the Stewarts, who were a family who had German connections as well. And Iseult Stewart apparently bought it, went up to Dublin, told him, "Stay there, and I'll go up to Dublin and buy you a suit." And she bought him a suit in Switzer's department store, came back down to the house. And my granddad picked up Herman Gertz in his motor car within 3 days and brought him to the house in Shankill, County Dublin, and puts the spy into my father's bedroom. I don't know where my father was supposed to be, or was he? I don't know, for a few days. And then the spy was put into some kind of a barn in the garden, and my grandmother would bring his meals out and everything. But my father, over those weeks or months that he was there, he somehow made this connection with this spy. He wouldn't have understood the politics or anything, but he felt maybe he found a father in him or something, because my grandfather was such an ideologue. He was sort of emotionally very absent in a lot of ways, but my father was just very taken. And the spy obviously liked my father, and he gave him his knife, his Third Reich knife, and his rifle, which Dad had until my dad would keep those until I think the 1980s, when they moved house, or 1990s. There was a burglary. So that's the story in brief of this spy. And he also, that spy, all the others took their cyanide capsules and died because they were under orders to do so, not to give any information. But Herman Gertz hung around in Ireland until 1947, from 1939 to 47. And then my grandfather, apparently all those years, had kept his Herman Gertz's cyanide capsule. And apparently Herman Gertz went to him and said, "Now I need that, please. They want to deport me back to Germany. There's no way I'm going back there." And he took it, and he had a funeral in Dublin with a big Nazi banner over the coffin. It's an extraordinary story. I can't even believe it myself, but it's true. There's actual photographs of it.
Okay.
So, but we were always worried that, oh, maybe Grandad went a bit too far, but I think it was really just because he wanted to show that he wanted to, you know, create a problem for Britain. That was his motivation. He wasn't like a Nazi party member or anything like that.
Britain's trouble is Ireland's opportunity. Okay. Siofra, I was wondering about, you know, the government, you know, the official side of, you know, commemoration. Is there right now, you mentioned the middle classes, their refusal of commemorating the Irish heroes, but what about the government right now, this official response to Irish history? Do you see anything going on right now after, you know, in this decade of celebrations, and how do you see this decade of celebrations?
Absolutely massively disappointing. Absolutely massively disappointing. Oh, I am so sick of COVID. It incenses me. It really does. It's an excuse for everything. Oh, we can't send the army down to do the, you know, the parade for Kevin Barry's commemoration. Oh, no, no, no. It's all about COVID. It really makes me very annoyed. So you better not keep me on that subject. They're not going to do anything for Kevin Barry's commemoration.
They're not going, and it's 100 years, 100 years this year, right? Okay, and there will be no commemoration whatsoever.
It's appalling, absolutely. Yeah, okay. No, it really, except Dublin is under lockdown now, usual boring stuff. And then down in County Carlow, where Kevin was from, we are with the Barrys and the whole committee, the Rathvilly committee. We've arranged and fundraised. Well, I didn't do much, but they really did it all, for a full bronze life-size statue of Kevin Barry to be erected on the 1st of November. Now, who knows what's going to happen now? Maybe everybody be locked up again. I don't know. It really makes me very annoyed. So don't keep me on the subject of it, please.
I wanted to show another video that you sent a link to us about Kevin Barry. I think it's the link by Kristen Moore. I think it's very interesting. Okay, so just a moment. I will set up everything here.
He's a fantastic singer, folk singer in Ireland. Yeah. Fantastic, probably the best folk singer.
I agree with you. I like him very much. But, you know, let me just find the video here. Okay. It's here.
And interestingly, Barry's brother is another singer that you may or not have heard of, Luca Bloom. Luca Bloom changed his name from Moore to Luca Bloom so that he wouldn't be associated with his brother, not because there was any animosity, but because he needed to be famous in his own right. So whatever. His Christian name, Luca Bloom, is Kevin Barry Moore, because a lot of people were named after Kevin Barry. So a lot of people have the name Kevin Barry something. It's because they've just wanted to remember those heroes, but that doesn't happen anymore. People are not proud at all anymore. In general, of course, the people who are proud are the so-called right-wing lunatics. You know, I don't believe that they all are, but that's the way things are these days, very polarized. And remember as well that I work with prisoners. I work with political prisoners in Portlaoise prison. I talk to them about all these issues all the time in our writing workshops. So I can see it from all perspectives, to be honest. And Irish history, yeah, it's too complicated and too difficult, you know.
Okay. So I'm gonna show the the video right now.
High upon the gallows tree, Calvin Barry gave his young life for the cause of liberty. Just a lad of 18 summers, yet there's no one can deny, as he walked to that morning, he proudly held his head on high, and just before he faced the hangman, in his dreary prison cell, English soldiers tortured Mary because he would not tell on the names of his bereft comrades, and those things they wish to know. Turning farmer will tell you, Calvin Barry answered no.
Ida, do you have another question?
Victor Augusto sent a question, but I think, I don't know if you want to say something else, because he says, you mentioned that you had a dream and then you started writing your novel Malinsky and your travelogue. I would like to know more about your creative writing process. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about it, and also because you work with when you are teaching writing, you work with the hero's journey. I think that perhaps you could talk a little bit how it works while you are working with prisoners, as you mentioned, or with other different people that are interested.
Yeah, well, the creative process I find it can be really benefited by the hero's journey, because it's an archetypal narrative that, you know, every step of the journey is quite powerful and transformative. So when I bring people through that journey in creative writing workshops, they really get to see something about themselves. So I wanted to develop it as a tool for self-reflection for prisoners. And that's my next plan, but everything's locked up. Well, of course they're locked up, but you know, I'm not allowed in either. So always trying to get into the prison because they use it in Nebraska Penitentiary as a tool for self-reflection for the prisoners. And I think, how could it not be so beneficial, like for prisoners, to really reflect on everything, to have the chance for reflection? Because I know that in the prisons they have TVs in their cells. It's like, what is that going to do for their creativity? You know, so I will eventually get it off the ground. I want to do programs in prison that work with the hero's journey, and to see where that brings them on their life journey, on their understanding of themselves, on their life path, the patterns they created. Any one of us could be a prisoner. That's what I see every time I go in there. Any one of us, you just make one mistake and everything changes. The Buddhists call it karma. The Hindus call it karma. But everything can change because of one action. You just went too far or whatever, or you were maybe set up as well. That's another possibility. But it's a fascinating thing, and I would just love to bring the hero's journey into prisons. I work with it, you know, mostly with adults in some mental health centers. I sometimes run those workshops at home, but the hero's journey helped me it helps me to, it's used as a structural template for screenplay writing. So it really helped me with that. When I was, a couple of screenplays I've written, you know, it really helps structure that. Somebody called Christopher Vogler simplified the hero's journey. The hero's journey comes from Joseph Campbell's work. He's an American mythologist. And this is just for people who may not know, that it's comes from his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he was a man with the most extraordinary knowledge of mythologies from the people of India, from the ancient Vedas to the Native Americans, to the Arthurian legends. He did his MA in Arthurian legend. You know, he had an incredible mind, incredible knowledge. And The Hero with a Thousand Faces is one of the most accessible of his books. He's written volumes about mythology. So he's extraordinary, really extraordinary. But anyway, Christopher Vogler distilled from The Hero with a Thousand Faces these 12 steps of the hero's journey. And it works. But if you rely on it too much as a formula, it will not be creative, you know, because if you rely too much on a certain form or formula, it will inhibit your creativity. You know, the story has to be led always by the characters. It must be led by the characters. And I think
But in the sense of the using dreams and visions, it's your personal writing in the sense that you don't work as a part of your method of teaching or something like that.
No, it's very much, we go into what I call dream time in my workshops, because to access your creativity, you need to break down the wall between the subconscious and the conscious mind. We're very, very, very driven by our left brain in our society. It's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. We need to rescue ourselves, our true selves, from that. We need to find the feminine, the creative within ourselves, and to make that flow. So how I do it in the workshops is I get people into a meditation. And then once they're very relaxed, I then give them images to work with. For example, in the hero's journey, crossing the threshold, that stage of the journey, I would say, now you are at a bridge, and that bridge can be a stone bridge, a wooden bridge. It can be over a calm river or a torrential river. And at the bridge, there's a guardian, you know, and from there, magic happens, you know, and people go, wow, I can't believe I wrote this. We share the work then. It's really magical process, because we're bypassing, you know, the to-do list that we always have in our head. And I have to do this and I have to do that. And all the technology that we use, it ruins our true, authentic selves. You know, of course, technology is very useful, but it's getting a bit over the top now, to be honest.
And Siofra, I'd like to ask you about what do you have in mind about your future publications? Your book on 12th century France will come out, but what is next for you now? Are you thinking of writing something else?
12th century novel is not yet published, and it hasn't, you know, been taken yet by anybody. It's with an agent, my agent in Madrid, and somebody was very interested recently, but they were publishing something very similar. So that's my dream, that's the next publication. I'm really excited about it. And so this is where I also have to talk about another big project that I'm involved with. Really, since I finished the Kevin Barry book in the summer, I've been very involved with a very, very different project called What About Us? It's a musical. It involves Israel, Palestine, and Ireland. It involves everything we've been speaking about conflict and resolution, the hope for peace. It's going to be obviously a musical, so there's a lot of musicians involved. We need to find better ways all the time for Israelis to collaborate with Palestinians. This is logistically very difficult. Of course, in lockdown, a lot of them are working on Zoom, but that isn't even sometimes possible with the Palestinians. And so I really hope soon we have more of the Palestinian musicians. We have musicians here. But what my job in the whole thing is to write the story. So it's a love story, and it spans thousands of years. The people Stephen Byrne and his partner Finola Harrington are the founders of What About Us, the musical, and they have a company called Ripple Zoo, which works to promote like good causes, basically. So it's really exciting, and we do story workshops every week. We have all sorts of different meetings every week, and I'm, write a new scene every few weeks for the musicians to respond to. And I've never been working on anything so collaborative ever, really. So it's very exciting, and we plan to have it performed in Jerusalem and Dublin in 2022, no matter what.
Okay.
Oh wow.
And is it your first work for theater?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did do screen, but no, it's my first thing like this ever. So it's very exciting. It's certainly hugely refreshing after years of Kevin Barry. And
I can imagine.
Yeah. So it's a wonderful project.
And I would like to ask about, how do you see yourself as a writer in the world, and how do you, are link it to this kind of, issues, or, nowadays it's such an amount of different issues like LGBTQ and gender and racism and so on. How did you engage or not with this kind of thing, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, everything is very dangerously politicized at the moment. And as you can see, J.K. Rowling, the way she spoke about transgender people, she's being vilified for that. I'm not actually fully aware of exactly what she said, but I think everybody has the right to speak. Does she have to be vilified in silence? I don't know. It's very complicated. I don't want to get involved at all. Really, I don't. I'm not really interested in issues as such. For me, the extinction of animals would be very dear to my heart in terms of a cause. And the other thing that is totally not talked about, and it's so disgraceful, is child trafficking. It makes me, I think about it every day. 5.5 million children trafficked every single year. And we can't even imagine what they go through. It's really dark. And it's very hard for us to look at as a global society, but we're going to have to, because it's creating a sickness. And a lot of people who are very important and powerful are involved, and it's very upsetting, and it has to be exposed. That is my most passionate issue on the planet right now. Yeah.
So we have no more questions, so I will conclude. Okay, I would like to conclude thanking you, Siofra, for accepting our invitation to talk with us today about your work. It was lovely. The links to Siofra's books are available in the description of this video. So if you're interested, just click on them and you're gonna see where you can buy her books. Okay, I also thank the audience on YouTube, your questions. And I invite you all to attend our panel sessions in the afternoon. The program is available at the conference website, even3.com.br/ABEI 2020. So you're going to see all the abstracts and the titles, so you can choose the panel you want to watch. And at 5 p.m. we have an interview with Maurice Fitzpatrick about the movie In the Name of Peace, John Hume in America. Okay, so thank you all. Thank you, Siofra.
Thank you, Siofra.
Thank you so much. Yeah. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.